This decision, yes? Is that fair to say? All right, great. So, do you know how many transgender Americans have been mass shooters over the last 10 years?
Too many.
It's 5. Okay, now 5 is a lot, right? I'm gonna give you some credit. Do you know how many mass shooters there have been in America over the last 10 years?
Counting or not counting gang violence?
Get down. What the fuck?
Well, Trump just confirmed it. Charlie Kirk wasn't alive today. He has spent his whole career talking about Black American violence and his whole career trashing us and trying to make us seem like we're this terrible group of people. And we just need so much reformation and they're so much better than us. And he used to do statistic after statistic, tearing us down. Statistic after statistic, talking about how we were like this and we were like this. And ironically, he was unalived by his own people. Can you people leave us alone now? Leave us alone. You have your own problems, just like every culture has its problems. You have your own problems. You have your own problems, and you have a lot of them. A lot. Leave us alone. Go take care of your home. Clean up your mess first. One of your people who spent his whole career trashing us was unalived by you. Leave us alone. Go clean up your house first. Stop worrying about what's going on in our backyard. We know we have some stuff to clean up, but the problem is you keep thinking your disgusting house that's full of maggots and disgusting things does not need to be cleaned up. Go clean up your nasty house.
The lights blaze across an auditorium packed with restless energy. Half the crowd cheers, fists raised in defiance. The other half hisses, their boos cutting through the noise like broken glass. On stage, a man in a crisp suit grips the microphone, his posture as rigid as his words. His name, Charlie Kirk. To his supporters, he is a truth teller, a warrior for conservative values. To his critics, he is a provocateur, a dangerous symbol of America's growing divide. The scene feels less like a political rally and more like a rock concert or a battlefield. Kirk feeds off the energy, his voice sharp, his words calculated to sting. Every phrase is designed to ignite applause from one side and outrage from the other. It is theater, but with real consequences. For every cheer, there is a headline. For every laugh, a new wave of anger. Charlie Kirk has built a career not on consensus, but on conflict. But behind the lights and the cameras lies a question bigger than any speech. How did a boy from the suburbs of Illinois become one of the most polarizing figures in America's culture wars? And what happens when a life built on division begins to collapse under the weight of its own fire? This is not the story of a president or a seasoned politician. It is the story of a young man who turned outrage into influence, controversy into currency, and polarization into power. It is also the story of how that power carries a price, one that can consume reputations, families, and even the very voice that built it. This is Charlie Kirk, killed by division, the final price of a polarized voice. Charlie Kirk's story does not begin in the marble halls of Washington, D.C., but in the quiet suburbs of Arlington Heights, Illinois. Born in 1993, he was the son of Robert Kirk, an architect, and a mother who worked part-time while raising their family. His upbringing was middle-class, safe, suburban, the kind of environment designed to instill stability, not controversy. But Charlie was restless. From an early age, he displayed a sharp tongue and a knack for public speaking. Teachers described him as confident, even cocky. He relished debate, not just for the competition, but for the spectacle of it. The defining moment of his youth came in high school. While many of his peers were preparing for SATs and homecoming, Kirk was writing essays and delivering speeches. One of those essays, critiquing liberal bias in textbooks, caught the attention of conservative media outlets. Suddenly, this teenager from Illinois was invited onto Fox News, speaking to a national audience about education and politics. For most kids, it would have been a one-off thrill. For Charlie Kirk, it was a spark. He attended Wheeling High School, where he played basketball, but unlike many of his classmates, his future wasn't shaped by sports or academics. It was shaped by politics. In 2012, at just 18 years old, Kirk made a decision that would define his career. He founded Turning Point USA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to mobilizing conservative students on college campuses. At first, it was nothing more than a scrappy idea. Kirk had no degree, no connections in Washington, and no formal political training. What he did have was an instinct for media, a talent for provocation, and an ability to harness the growing conservative discontent among America's youth. Turning Point USA began modestly: pamphlets, speaking events, student recruitment drives. But Kirk had a genius for branding. He understood that in the social media age, politics was less about policy and more about performance. He courted donors aggressively, winning over wealthy conservatives eager to invest in the next generation of right-wing leadership. With their support, Turning Point expanded rapidly, planting chapters across college campuses nationwide. By his early 20s, Kirk was a fixture at conservative conferences, delivering speeches with the cadence of a seasoned professional. He had turned youthful arrogance into a political weapon, painting himself as the fearless voice of students silenced by liberal academia. His rallies weren't about quiet persuasion, they were about spectacle. Microphones, applause lines, soundbites tailor-made for cable news. For a boy who never finished college, Kirk was building something more valuable than a degree: influence. He cultivated relationships with powerful figures, including Donald Trump Jr. and eventually the president himself. He launched podcasts, wrote books, and built a personal brand that blurred the line between activist, entertainer, and provocateur. Charlie Kirk had gone from suburban Illinois to the national stage in less than a decade. He was young, ambitious, and polarizing. To his supporters, he was proof that you didn't need pedigree or Ivy League credentials to shake the system. To his critics, he was the embodiment of America's new culture war: loud, divisive, and dangerously effective. The rise was meteoric. But as with every figure who thrives on outrage, the same fuel that propelled him upward would eventually drag him down. By the mid-2010s, Charlie Kirk was no longer just a political wunderkind, he was a brand. What had begun as a fledgling campus group had grown into a powerhouse of influence. Under his leadership, Turning Point USA became a sprawling network with chapters at hundreds of colleges, a multimillion-dollar budget, and the backing of some of the most powerful figures in conservative politics. Kirk's genius was not policy expertise. He was not a legislator, a lawyer, or a policy scholar. His genius was performance. He understood that politics in the digital age wasn't fought in white papers or committee hearings. It was fought in viral clips, tweets, and soundbites tailor-made for cable news. At rallies and conferences, he delivered zingers that landed like punches, knowing full well they'd be clipped, shared, and replayed online. As America lurched into an era of culture wars, Kirk positioned himself at the center. On Fox News, he became a familiar face, the youthful warrior for conservative causes, jousting with liberal opponents in fiery segments. His podcast climbed the charts, drawing millions of listeners. On Twitter, he cultivated a following of hundreds of thousands, his posts a mix of provocation, grievance, and rallying cries for his movement. The 2016 election was his breakthrough. While many established conservatives were skeptical of Donald Trump, Kirk saw opportunity. He embraced Trump early, aligning Turning Point USA with the MAGA movement. In return, he gained access to the inner circle of Republican politics. He appeared at rallies, his organization hosted events where Trump's children spoke, and he became one of the most prominent young faces of the president's base. Turning Point USA was no longer just a student group, it was an empire. Annual conferences drew thousands of young conservatives, complete with celebrity guest speakers, light shows, and the feel of a cultural festival as much as a political event. For his critics, this was evidence that Kirk had turned politics into spectacle. For his supporters, it was proof he had tapped into something real, a hunger among young Americans for an unapologetic, combative brand of conservatism. By his mid-20s, Kirk was seated alongside senators and governors at major events, his influence undeniable. He published books, launched media spin-offs like Turning Point Action, and expanded his footprint into churches and high schools. He wasn't just shaping college conservatives anymore. He was building an entire ecosystem designed to mold the next generation of right-wing voters. But fame on this scale always comes with a cost. Kirk's rise relied on sharpening divides, on delivering language that thrilled his audience and enraged his opponents. Each headline brought him more attention, but also more controversy. His critics accused him of spreading misinformation, of fueling polarization, of turning young Americans against each other, in the name of ideology. Yet for Charlie Kirk, this was the height of his fame. He was young, powerful, and perfectly positioned at the intersection of politics, media, and culture. To his fans, he was the fearless voice their generation needed. To his detractors, he was a dangerous provocateur. Either way, one truth was undeniable. Charlie Kirk had mastered the art of thriving in division. What no one knew then was that the very division that lifted him to power would also set the stage for his downfall. At the height of his fame, Charlie Kirk stood as a symbol of youthful conservative power, commanding stages packed with cheering students and appearing regularly on primetime television. But even then, the first cracks in his carefully cultivated image began to appear. The very style that propelled him to influence, provocation, confrontation, and outrage, also made him a lightning rod for criticism. His speeches and podcasts often blurred the line between sharp political commentary and incendiary rhetoric. He thrived on drawing sharp distinctions between us and them, but in doing so, he deepened the very divides he claimed to be addressing. Critics accused him of spreading misinformation, particularly during the most heated moments of the culture wars. On issues of race, immigration, and gender, his statements often ignited firestorms, with detractors labeling him more of an instigator than a thought leader. During the COVID-19 pandemic, his questioning of public health policies and vaccines earned him applause from some, but condemnation from scientists, doctors, and even fellow conservatives who worried his words went too far. The more Kirk leaned into controversy, the more his public identity shifted. To his core audience, he was fearless, saying what others were too afraid to say. But to the broader public, he began to look less like a leader and more like a provocateur addicted to the spotlight. Universities barred his events, citing security concerns. Protesters regularly disrupted his speeches, turning them into spectacles of shouting matches and police interventions. Even within conservative circles, whispers grew. Was Kirk helping the movement, or was he turning it into a circus? Some older strategists worried that his brand of performative politics was alienating moderates, boxing the movement into a corner defined by division. His ties to Donald Trump and embrace of combative social media culture gave him immense reach, but they also tethered him to the volatility of a political brand built on outrage. The cracks weren't enough to topple him, not yet. His organization still thrived, his influence still commanded attention. But the sheen of untouchability had worn thin. Instead of being simply the voice of a generation, Charlie Kirk was becoming the face of America's polarization. The question was no longer whether Kirk could rally a crowd. It was whether his voice was leading a movement or simply fueling a fire that threatened to consume him. By the late 2010s, Charlie Kirk was no longer just a rising voice of conservatism, he was one of its most visible faces. But as his star climbed higher, the controversies surrounding him began to multiply. What had once been the engine of his fame, provocation, division, and relentless showmanship, was transforming into the very weight dragging him down. The turning point came during the 2020 election cycle. Kirk threw the full weight of Turning Point USA and its media empire behind Donald Trump's re-election campaign. He appeared at rallies, amplified slogans on social media, and positioned himself as one of Trump's most loyal foot soldiers. But loyalty in politics is a double-edged sword. When Trump lost, Kirk's brand was suddenly tethered to a defeat that many within the party struggled to process. Instead of recalibrating, Kirk doubled down. On his podcast and Twitter feed, he repeated claims of election fraud, claims that courts and state officials across the country had dismissed. His words were cheered by his base, but they came at a cost. Mainstream media painted him as a propagandist, and even some longtime conservative allies began to distance themselves. The climax of this rhetoric came on January 6, 2021. Though Kirk did not storm the Capitol, his organization had promoted events tied to the protest in Washington, D.C., and his fiery speeches in the days leading up to it became part of the controversy. Headlines tied his name to the chaos, and while he denied responsibility, the damage was done. For many Americans, Charlie Kirk's voice was no longer just partisan, it was dangerous. Sponsors began to quietly retreat. Universities canceled his speaking events, citing safety concerns. Some conservative donors, wary of being linked to insurrectionist sentiment, cut ties or reduced their funding. Within his own movement, fissures widened. Older conservatives viewed him as reckless, while younger activists questioned whether his strategy of endless confrontation was sustainable. Kirk himself seemed unable or unwilling to change course. His podcast episodes grew angrier, his tweets more combative. He railed against big tech censorship when platforms flagged or restricted his posts. He mocked his critics, painting himself as a victim of the liberal establishment. To his most loyal supporters, this defiance only strengthened their admiration. But to everyone else, it reinforced the image of a man spiraling deeper into extremism. The personal toll became evident as well. Once hailed as a fresh, articulate face for the conservative movement, Kirk now looked increasingly isolated, defined more by controversy than by accomplishment. Even when he tried to pivot, emphasizing faith-based activism or discussing policy, his reputation preceded him. He wasn't seen as a thinker or a strategist. He was seen as the provocateur, the man who thrived on outrage. The downfall was not sudden, but cumulative. Each controversy chipped away at his credibility. Each headline pushed him further into the margins. His influence within conservative youth circles remained strong, but his ability to shape the broader conversation diminished. Once welcomed on major television networks, he found himself relegated to echo chambers, speaking mostly to those who already agreed with him. Perhaps the most damning sign of decline was the reaction of his opponents and his allies. Liberals no longer debated him, they dismissed him. Conservatives no longer elevated him as the future. They tolerated him as a useful tool for energizing a base. The promise of Charlie Kirk as a transformative figure had curdled into the reality of Charlie Kirk as a cautionary tale. The boy from Illinois who once dreamed of influence had built an empire on polarization, but that empire came with a cost. The microphone that had amplified his rise was now the very symbol of his undoing, every word recorded, scrutinized, and weaponized against him. This was Charlie Kirk's downfall, not a single collapse, but 1,000 cuts, each one delivered by the very division that had been his fuel. He had built a career on fire, and now he was the one being consumed by the flames. For Charlie Kirk, rock bottom did not look like silence. It looked like isolation inside a storm of his own making. By the early 2020s, he was still speaking, still broadcasting, still commanding a loyal audience. But beyond that circle of diehard supporters, his credibility had withered. The young activist who once dazzled donors and packed auditoriums was now regarded by much of the public, and even parts of his own movement, as a liability. Mainstream networks no longer called. Corporate sponsors who had once seen Turning Point USA as a fresh conservative brand quietly backed away. University campuses, which had been his proving ground, became battlegrounds where his events attracted more protesters than attendees. For every student who cheered his arrival, dozens more stood outside with signs, chanting against his presence. The spectacle no longer worked in his favor. It defined him as a polarizing figure who could not step onto a campus without chaos following. Inside conservative ranks, the fractures deepened. Party elders who had once welcomed him as a youthful face of the movement now kept their distance. His unwavering loyalty to Donald Trump alienated those trying to steer the GOP toward a broader coalition. Even among his peers, whispers circulated that Kirk was more concerned with clicks and controversy than with strategy or policy. He was no longer the next generation. He was the cautionary tale of what happens when politics becomes performance. Personally, the toll was unmistakable. While he continued to project confidence in public, insiders described him as weary, burdened by the non-stop cycle of outrage he had created. The microphone, once his greatest weapon, now felt like a chain. Every word was expected to be sharper than the last, every statement more incendiary. He had built an empire on division, and now he was trapped inside it. Rock bottom for Charlie Kirk was not marked by bankruptcy or imprisonment. It was marked by irrelevance outside his base. He remained influential within the echo chamber of conservative youth rallies and podcasts, but beyond those walls, his voice carried little weight. Instead of being seen as a future leader, he was viewed as a symptom of America's sickness, a nation so fractured that division itself had become a career. The boy from suburban Illinois had once dreamed of shaping history. Now he was the embodiment of a political age defined by polarization, his legacy overshadowed by the very flames he had fanned. Rock bottom for Charlie Kirk was realizing that his voice could fill rooms, but it could no longer change minds. Charlie Kirk's story is not just about one man's rise and fall, is a mirror held up to a nation at war with itself. His career forces us to ask, did he create the polarization, or was he simply a product of it? On one level, Kirk was undeniably skilled. He understood the mechanics of modern media better than most seasoned politicians. He knew how to turn outrage into clicks, division into dollars, and applause lines into headlines. He recognized that in the age of Twitter, YouTube, and cable news, a sharp soundbite mattered more than a carefully crafted policy. He wasn't wrong. In fact, he was ahead of the curve. But on another level, Kirk was a reflection of something larger, a culture that rewards conflict over compromise, drama over nuance. He gave his audiences exactly what they craved: certainty, simplicity, and an enemy to blame. In doing so, he became less a leader and more a lightning rod, a vessel for America's anger rather than a guide through it. The so-called Sheen curse belonged to Hollywood. The Kirk curse, if there's one, belongs to politics. It is the curse of building a career on division in a country already fractured. For Kirk, this meant that his greatest asset, his voice, was also his greatest liability. Every speech, every podcast, every tweet that made him famous also pushed him further into a box where his only identity was that of a polarizer. And yet, his legacy cannot be dismissed outright. Kirk showed how quickly influence could be built in the modern age, how a teenager with no degree and no connections could create a national movement out of thin air. He demonstrated the power of youth activism, branding, and media savvy. For better or worse, he helped shape how politics is practiced today. But the reflection is sobering. If Charlie Kirk is a product of America's political culture, then what does his story say about us? Are we complicit in elevating voices that divide? Do we reward spectacle over substance, anger over answers? Kirk's legacy is not just his own. It is a warning about the final price of a polarized society, where voices like his do not just rise, but inevitably consume themselves. In the end, Charlie Kirk's story is not only about a man undone by division. It is about a country that mistook division for strength until it realized the cost. The lights dim. A microphone lies abandoned on a stage, the crowd long gone, their cheers and jeers fading into memory. For years, Charlie Kirk lived in this space, in the noise, the conflict, the relentless energy of division. It made him famous. It made him powerful. But in the end, it also left him stranded, a man defined not by unity or vision, but by the battles he chose to fight. Kirk's journey, from a suburban teenager with a sharp tongue to the face of a national movement, is a testament to how quickly influence can rise in the modern age. But is also a warning of how fragile that influence becomes when it is built on polarization. A voice that thrives only in conflict eventually finds itself drowned by the very noise it creates. The tragedy of Charlie Kirk is not that he spoke too loudly, is that his voice could never escape the echo chamber he helped build. To his followers, he remains a hero. To his critics, he is a cautionary tale. To history, he may be remembered less as a leader and more as a symbol of an era when America mistook division for destiny. And so we are left with the final question. Was Charlie Kirk truly killed by division? Or was he simply proof that in a polarized nation, no voice can survive without being consumed? Because in the end, the spotlight does not lie. It shows us not just the man at the microphone, but the society that put him there. And in Charlie Kirk's story, the reflection we see is our own.